Meet Jane Seymour, the queen who gave Henry VIII what he wanted most. History often remembers Jane Seymour as the quiet, obedient wife of Henry VIII, but there's far more to her story than meets the eye. She wasn't just the woman who followed the fiery Anne Boleyn. She was the one who gave Henry his long-awaited dream, a legitimate male heir. For that alone, she's often referred to as his favorite wife. Born around 1508 or 1509 at the Seymour family estate of Wolf Hall in Wiltshire, Jane came from a noble but relatively modest background. Her family had ties to royal blood through Edward III, but they weren't part of the kingdom's most elite circles. No one could have guessed that young Jane, the eldest daughter in a house of 10 children, would one day wear the crown of England. Unlike Henry's first two queens, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, Jane didn't receive a sophisticated European education. Her learning was modest, likely focused on traditional skills expected of noble women: reading, writing, sewing, and courtly manners. She was devoutly Catholic and possibly spoke enough French to hold her own in conversation, a useful skill for someone destined for court life. Yet Jane was never considered particularly beautiful or brilliant, and by the standards of the Tudor court, she was already considered a bit old when she caught the king's eye in her late 20s. So, what was it about Jane that made Henry fall for her? She was everything Anne Boleyn wasn't. Where Anne had been bold, sharp, and opinionated, Jane was soft-spoken, modest, and seemingly submissive. But don't be fooled. Beneath her quiet exterior was a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. Guided by powerful allies and her ambitious family, Jane played her part well. She held out for marriage, never settling for just being another mistress. That patience and clever restraint paid off. Jane Seymour wasn't just a gentle woman in the shadows of history. She was a queen who changed the Tudor dynasty forever. In giving Henry his only legitimate son, Edward VI, she secured her place not just in his heart, but in the legacy of England itself. The rise of Jane Seymour, from court attendant to Queen of England. Long before she became Henry VIII's third wife, Jane Seymour lived in the shadows of two queens. She entered royal service as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon, quietly observing the intense politics of the Tudor court. When Catherine was pushed aside in favor of the bold and controversial Anne Boleyn, Jane didn't leave. She simply moved into Anne's household, maintaining her place at court and biding her time. Her years in royal service gave Jane a rare insight into the king's courtship patterns, the stakes of royal favor, and the fragile line between influence and downfall. And whether by chance or calculation, Jane managed to navigate this treacherous environment with care and patience. By the end of 1535, a shift was taking place. Anne Boleyn, once the captivating object of Henry's obsession, was beginning to lose her grip on the king. Her final pregnancy ended in miscarriage in early 1536, and the failure to produce a male heir weighed heavily on their marriage. In the midst of this personal and political crisis, Jane began to emerge as a quiet but compelling presence in Henry's life. She wasn't flashy or outspoken like, and quite the opposite. Jane's calm demeanor, modesty, and traditional values seemed to offer Henry the emotional stability he craved. Their interactions likely began innocently enough, but it wasn't long before whispers at court hinted at a growing closeness between the king and this unassuming lady-in-waiting. While the timeline remains unclear, it's likely that by early 1536, Jane had captured the king's attention in a serious way. Her presence at court became more visible, and Henry's favor toward her was harder to ignore. Whether Jane acted out of ambition, personal conviction, or a mix of both, her rise would soon change English history forever. She had learned from watching two queens, one cast aside, the other soon to fall. And now, it was Jane's turn to step into the spotlight. Henry VIII and Jane Seymour, a dangerous game of love and power. By the beginning of 1536, Jane Seymour was no longer just another court lady. She was becoming the center of Henry VIII's attention. The king, restless and disillusioned with his marriage to Anne Boleyn, found something deeply appealing in Jane's reserved, gentle nature. As Anne's influence began to fade, Jane rose, quietly but deliberately, capturing the monarch's increasingly focused gaze. Henry began showering Jane with expensive gifts, fine jewelry, money, and lavish tokens of his affection. But Jane, far from acting flattered or eager, did something unexpected. She refused. She returned the presents untouched, making it clear that her virtue was not for sale. She even reportedly fell to her knees and asked the king to protect her honor, stating that she would accept no gift unless it came from a husband, not a suitor. This bold refusal wasn't a naive gesture. It was calculated and familiar. A decade earlier, Anne Boleyn had used the same tactic, rejecting Henry's advances until he offered her a crown instead of companionship. Now, Jane was following that same script, but with a very different tone. Where Anne had been witty and assertive, Jane played the part of the humble and pious woman, letting others frame her as the ideal Tudor bride. Henry was enthralled. Jane's resistance only deepened his desire to win her over. In his eyes, she was everything and no longer was modest, obedient, and untouched. Behind the scenes, Jane's family, particularly her ambitious brothers, encouraged the match, seeing the chance to elevate the Seymour name to unimaginable heights. The king even arranged for Jane to have private rooms near his own, but under the watchful eyes of her family, maintaining the illusion of propriety. This wasn't just a romance, it was a political shift in motion. Jane had positioned herself perfectly. She wasn't just playing hard to get, she was playing for the crown. Jane Seymour, the queen-in-waiting backed by power and plot. Jane Seymour's sudden rise to power was no mere stroke of luck. Behind her calm demeanor and quiet smile was a network of powerful players working tirelessly to unseat Queen Anne Boleyn, and Jane was at the center of their plan. While she appeared modest and dutiful, she had the backing of Anne's fiercest enemies and the full support of her own upwardly mobile family. Among her strongest allies was her brother, Edward Seymour, a man with sharp political instincts and a clear understanding of what Jane's potential queenship could mean for their family's future. Edward wasn't simply an onlooker to Jane's courtship with Henry VIII. He was a key architect. With Anne Boleyn's position growing weaker by the day, Jane became the perfect alternative. Uncontroversial, loyal to traditional values, and free from the scandals that surrounded the current queen. Those close to Jane likely coached her carefully on how to behave around the king. She was advised to present herself as the embodiment of virtue, refined, religious, and obedient, everything and was not. But Jane's charm wasn't limited to sweetness. She was also reportedly encouraged to gently question the legitimacy of Henry's marriage to Anne, reinforcing the view held by many that Anne's reign was cursed and unlawful. These subtle criticisms, whispered behind veils of modesty, helped build a case for Jane as a more suitable queen. This wasn't just about love or romance. It was a carefully managed campaign. Every word Jane spoke, every gesture she made, reinforced an image of purity and devotion that contrasted perfectly with Anne's dramatic fall from favor. Jane didn't need to be outspoken. Her silence spoke volumes. By aligning herself with the conservative faction at court and distancing herself from Anne's reformist circle, Jane made herself not only appealing to Henry, but acceptable to his advisors and subjects. In a court full of ambition, betrayal, and shifting loyalties, Jane's quiet ascent was anything but accidental. She wasn't just the king's next love, she was the next political solution. From execution to I do, the scandalously swift rise of Jane Seymour. When Anne Boleyn lost her head on May 19, 1536, the shock had barely settled before a new queen was already waiting in the wings. Just one day later, Henry VIII was officially betrothed to Jane Seymour. By May 30th, less than 2 weeks after Anne's brutal execution, Jane and Henry were husband and wife. To the public, the timing was impossible to ignore and impossible to stomach. Whispers spread through London's crowded streets and noble halls. Could a love story truly bloom so fast? Or had the foundations been laid long before Anne's downfall? Many suspected the latter. Though the king and his court maintained appearances, few believed the relationship had only recently begun. Jane had been quietly present at court for years, and her emergence as a romantic contender just before Anne's arrest seemed too convenient. The speed with which the wedding took place, accompanied by the swift dismantling of all things associated with, and added fuel to the growing fire of speculation. The rapid transition raised troubling questions about Henry's motives and Jane's role. Was she an innocent woman caught in the machinery of Tudor politics, or had she knowingly stepped over a condemned queen's body to seize the crown? With the ink barely dry on Anne's death warrant, Jane slipped into the position of queen consort with hardly a pause. To some, the entire episode reeked of premeditation. The wedding arrangements appeared too well organized, the court too prepared for a new queen. Even foreign ambassadors commented on how swiftly Henry had moved on, suggesting that Jane's ascendancy had been in motion while Anne was still alive. Still, the king didn't seem to care about appearances. Henry portrayed Jane as his reward for enduring past turmoil, a gentle, obedient contrast to the fiery Anne. But for many onlookers, Jane's image would forever be tied to the timing of her triumph. Whether orchestrated or opportunistic, her rise came at a heavy cost. And with the ink still wet on Anne's tragic end, Jane Seymour stepped into history, crowned not only by a wedding ring, but by controversy. Queen Jane Seymour, the silent strategist behind the throne. Upon becoming queen, Jane Seymour carefully crafted a public image of quiet loyalty and traditional virtue. Her official motto, "Bound to obey and serve," wasn't just decorative, it was a statement. In a court still reeling from Anne Boleyn's assertiveness and downfall, Jane's demure presence was a soothing contrast. She embraced the role of the obedient consort, the model Tudor wife. But behind her modest motto was a woman who understood the influence that came with the crown. Jane may have avoided bold declarations, but she was no bystander. She quickly engaged in one of the most sensitive political matters of the time, the fractured relationship between Henry VIII and his eldest daughter, Princess Mary. Mary had been declared illegitimate after her mother, Catherine of Aragon, was set aside. Her refusal to acknowledge Henry's authority as head of the church or to denounce her mother's marriage as invalid had made her a pariah at court. Jane, however, made it her mission to help restore Mary to favor, both for the girl's sake and perhaps to stabilize the volatile royal household. Her efforts weren't without risk. Pleading on Mary's behalf meant treading into dangerous political waters. Henry was known for his temper and intolerance of dissent. Yet Jane persisted, using calm persuasion rather than confrontation. Her approach may have lacked Anne's fire, but it achieved results. Mary was eventually welcomed back into the royal fold, even if it meant her reluctant submission to Henry's demands. Jane's legacy as queen often centers on her maternal success, but her influence in reconciling father and daughter reveals a quieter form of power, one wielded with care, strategy, and a deep understanding of the Tudor court's treacherous dynamics. Jane Seymour, a careful voice in a dangerous court. Though often remembered for her quiet demeanor and traditional values, Queen Jane Seymour was no stranger to the high-stakes politics of Henry VIII's court. A devoted Catholic in a time of dramatic religious change, Jane had her own convictions, but she expressed them with caution and subtlety. At a time when Henry was dissolving England's monasteries and reshaping the church to suit his own power, Jane made a bold yet respectful appeal. She once fell to her knees before the king, asking him to restore some of the religious houses. The monasteries were cherished centers of faith and charity, symbols of the old world Jane had been raised in. But Henry's response was cold and terrifying. He cut her off with a warning. She would do well not to meddle in affairs beyond her station, and she should remember what happened to the last queen who had overstepped. The message was clear. Jane wisely withdrew from any further public interference in policy. Still, her influence at court was quietly felt. She subtly reshaped the royal image by encouraging a return to traditional English customs. French fashion, which had flourished under Anne Boleyn's reign, was now discouraged. Jane preferred modest gowns, English hoods, and a more restrained, conservative appearance for her ladies. It was a deliberate distancing from Anne's court, one that reinforced Jane's image as a proper, virtuous English queen. Rather than confront the king or his advisors directly, Jane focused on creating a calm and orderly royal household. rooted in values she believed in. While she may not have swayed Henry on grand religious reforms, her quiet defiance and measured restraint proved that influence could be wielded without force. In a court where a wrong word could mean ruin, or worse, Jane walked a fine line between loyalty, personal faith, and political survival. And in doing so, she left behind a legacy of quiet courage that history too often overlooks. Jane Seymour's triumph and tragedy as a Tudor queen. In early 1537, Jane Seymour achieved what no wife of Henry VIII had managed before. She became pregnant with a child the entire realm hoped would be a son. Her quiet rise to queenship had been steeped in caution and obedience, but now all eyes were on her, not as Henry's consort, but as the potential mother of England's next king. As the months passed, anticipation spread across the kingdom. A male heir would bring legitimacy to Henry's new marriage, stabilize the turbulent Tudor succession, and, most importantly, secure Jane's own position. She had stepped into the shoes of Anne Boleyn, whose failure to produce a son had cost her everything, including her life. For Jane, the stakes could not have been higher. On October 12, 1537, after 2 exhausting days of labor at Hampton Court Palace, Jane finally delivered a healthy baby boy, Edward, born on the feast day of Saint Edward the Confessor. The news sent ripples of celebration throughout England. Bonfires were lit, bells rang out, and feasts were held in the streets. Henry was overjoyed. After years of disappointment and political turmoil, he finally had his long-awaited heir. Jane, physically drained but triumphant, seemed to recover in the days immediately following the birth. Plans were already underway for her ceremonial churching, marking her return to public life. But joy quickly turned to fear. She began to show signs of serious postpartum complications, possibly infection or retained placenta, both common and deadly at the time. Despite the efforts of royal physicians, Jane's condition worsened. Just 12 days after bringing England its future king, she died on October 24th. She was only around 28 or 29 years old. Her death cast a shadow over Henry's joy, and he mourned her deeply. Unlike his other wives, Jane was never cast aside. She died a queen, honored in life and remembered in death. Her brief reign, defined by dignity, duty, and the birth of Prince Edward, ensured her place in Tudor history as the woman who gave England its male heir at the ultimate cost. The tragic end of Jane Seymour, a queen's sacrifice for the Tudor line. The joy surrounding the birth of Prince Edward on October 12, 1537, was overshadowed by an impending tragedy. Just 12 days after bringing the long-awaited male heir into the world, Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's beloved third wife, tragically passed away from postnatal complications. The joyful celebrations marking Edward's birth quickly gave way to mourning as the young queen's health deteriorated. Jane's death, believed to have been caused by a postpartum infection, came as a devastating blow to both Henry and the nation. Only 28 years old, Jane's life was cut short after a brief, but remarkable reign. She had secured the Tudor dynasty's future by giving birth to Edward, but in doing so, she sacrificed her own life. The circumstances of her death only deepened her tragic legacy as a queen who gave everything for her king and country. Her funeral, a grand and somber affair, took place at Windsor Castle, where Jane was laid to rest beside her royal ancestors. It was there, in the hallowed ground of St. George's Chapel, that Jane's final resting place became a symbol of her lasting importance in the eyes of Henry VIII. Their bond, though brief, was undeniably profound. In a poignant gesture that spoke volumes about her impact, Henry himself was buried beside her when he died in 1547, marking Jane's significance in his life. Though her life was tragically short, Jane Seymour's place in history was forever cemented. She not only provided England with its future king, but did so at the ultimate cost. Her story stands as a testament to the sacrifices made in the pursuit of royal duty, as well as the deep affection Henry had for her, an affection that endured long after her untimely death. Jane Seymour, a legacy of love, sacrifice, and controversy. Jane Seymour holds a singular place in the history of Henry VIII's wives. Unlike any of his other queens, she remains the only one to die while still holding the title of queen, the only one to bear him a male heir, and the only one to be laid to rest beside him at Windsor. Her legacy is immortalized not just in the annals of history but also in art, where her image is often depicted with affection and reverence. However, her legacy is not without questions. While Jane's tragic death following the birth of her son, Prince Edward, made her a beloved figure in the eyes of many, the circumstances surrounding her rise to the throne remain clouded with intrigue. Jane was in the right place at the right time, positioning herself as a replacement for Anne Boleyn when the king's marriage to and collapsed. It's said that she may have had political backing from Anne's enemies, including her own family, which supported her quest for the crown. But was Jane simply an innocent pawn in the drama of Henry's turbulent marriages, or was she complicit in the events that led to Anne Boleyn's downfall? There are hints that Jane may have subtly encouraged Henry to rid himself of Anne. She carefully crafted an image of innocence and piety, a stark contrast to Anne's fiery personality, which may have appealed to Henry's desires for stability and a male heir. But could this image have been a calculated move? Did Jane, knowing the stakes, align herself with Henry's ambitions at the expense of Anne's fate? This complex narrative leaves us pondering Jane's true role in the events that unfolded. Was she merely a dutiful and submissive wife, or did she play a more active part in shaping her destiny? As we reflect on her story, we invite you to share your thoughts. Do you see Jane Seymour as a tragic hero, or is there more to her story than meets the eye?